Everyone knows Anne Frank, her face, her diary, her story. But here's what almost no one talks about. Anne Frank didn't become the global symbol of the Holocaust because her story best represents the 6 million victims. Maybe it's because her story was the easiest for the world to face. Even as the fighting raged outside, she rewrote and revised her diary, believing that someday, someone would read it. She was right, but not in the way she intended. She wasn't the final editor of her own words. She didn't even get to finish her story. And yet, Anne has become an icon, not just of Jewish persecution, but of human resilience in the face of oppression. So, did Anne Frank become an icon because her story made the Holocaust easier to face? Anne Frank was born in 1929 into an assimilated Jewish family living in Germany. She was smart, spunky, and a little sassy, the apple of her father's eye. But her father, Otto, had his eye on the headlines, and what he saw scared him. When Anne was 4 years old, Otto moved the family to Amsterdam. He didn't like Germany's new chancellor one bit. Hitler had convinced Germans that the Jews were behind the country's poverty and inflation, and Otto was savvy enough to read the writing on the wall. He believed Amsterdam would be safe from the Nazi threat, and it was, until it wasn't. At 4 years old, Anne knew nothing about geopolitics. She adjusted quickly to life in Amsterdam and loved her progressive Montessori school, the perfect environment for a kid who hated sitting still. Anne was funny and dramatic and smart, and she blossomed at Montessori. When one teacher called her a chatterbox, Anne responded with a 3-page essay pledging to tone it down, while cheekily arguing that constant talking was simply an inherited female trait, and therefore totally not her fault. In another world, she could have been a star lawyer, a novelist, or an actress, any career that highlighted her natural tendency towards drama, wordplay, and cleverness. But like many gifted children, Anne was often lonely, so when her father handed her a journal and told her to write down her thoughts, she gave the notebook a name, Kitty, a stand-in for the true friendship she so desperately craved. Kitty was more than just a companion. The journal was where Anne began rehearsing for the life she dreamed of living. One day, she vowed, she would be a writer. Until then, she'd pour all her hopes and dreams and stories into Kitty, refining her craft on one page, lamenting her problems on the next. And Anne had a very serious problem. Her family had fled Germany's anti-Semitism, but Nazi hatred followed them to Amsterdam too. When Anne was 10 years old, she was unceremoniously kicked out of her beloved school. Not because she was a chatterbox, not because she couldn't hack the curriculum, but because Holland had fallen to Hitler in May of 1940. The new Nazi regime quickly instituted harsh, anti-Jewish racial laws, the same exact laws that Otto Frank had tried to escape. Laws that prohibited Jewish children from mingling with non-Jews. Laws that meant Anne was no longer allowed to study at the Montessori school that had been such a paradise of learning and exploration. Yet again, Otto could read the writing on the wall, and it was even more ominous than before. But all his attempts to secure US visas for his family ended in failure. The United States didn't want Jewish refugees flooding its borders, no matter how persecuted they were. And the persecution grew harsher by the day. In July of 1942, that persecution came to the Franks' door in the form of a letter summoning Anne's older sister Margot back to Germany for labor duty. If she didn't report to the German work camp in 10 days, the entire family would be arrested. No one knew exactly what labor duty entailed, but by this point, they knew it wasn't good. It was time for the Frank family to adopt Plan B, hiding. Plan A, of course, had been flee, but there was nowhere for the Franks to go. Otto Frank had spent months trying to get his family out of Europe. As door after door slammed in his face, he decided to make his own refuge, a little safe haven right under the noses of the SS. He chose a cluster of back rooms in his Amsterdam office. With the help of a trusted carpenter, he designed a swinging wall behind a bookcase, which led to a secret compartment where his family and a few others could hide. He called it the Annex. In the months before Margot's call-up letter, he stocked it with as many supplies and non-perishables as he could. He hadn't told his daughters about the secret rooms because he hoped he'd never have to use them. The Annex was an insurance policy in case of the worst-case scenario. After Margot's call-up letter, Otto and his wife Edith decided the worst-case scenario had arrived. In July of 1942, the Franks arrived at Otto's office, wearing as many clothes as they could, one layer on top of the next. They couldn't bring suitcases with them. They needed to look like a normal family visiting Dad at work. The Franks entered Otto's building. they would not come out for the next 2 years. The Franks were not alone in the Annex. Otto had arranged for another family as well as a single man to join them. Soon, the tight quarters grew unbearably cramped, as 5 adults and 3 teenagers silently adjusted to their new lives. Silence was their only defense and their only hope of survival. The Annex was in Otto's office, and for Otto's non-Jewish co-workers and employees, it was business as usual. Most of them were totally unaware that 8 Jews were silently clinging to their life in a secret compartment just feet away. It turned out that clinging to life was excruciatingly boring. First, there was the enforced silence. No joking or laughing or talking. No pacing, no leaving. Even regular bodily functions were forcefully suppressed. No coughing, no sneezing, no flushing toilets. Then there was the isolation. The same 8 faces, day after long, boring day. Being a teenager is already difficult. It's a time of uncertainty and exploration and independence. But the 3 teens in the Annex, Anne, her sister Margot, and Peter Van Pels, had to endure all the ups and downs of adolescence while crammed into a tiny space they could not leave. By now, Kitty was Anne's only real refuge, and she flooded the pages with her thoughts and frustrations and feelings, chronicling both the day-to-day indignities of life in the secret Annex, as well as her private hopes and dreams. She wrote about everything: God, religion, the nature of humanity, her crush on Peter Van Pels. In May of 1944, the Dutch government took to the radio to ask its citizens to keep records. After all this was over, after the German occupiers were gone, the Dutch wanted a record of the fact that they had resisted, that they had not gone quietly, that they had stood up and tried to fight the evil that was taking over their country. So they appealed to ordinary Dutch people: please keep your letters, keep your diaries. One day, these records will be useful. Anne heard the appeal. In the secret Annex, she began to revise her diary. Kitty was no longer just a friend, a companion in the gloom and boredom of the Annex. The journal was now a valuable historical record, and this was to be Anne's chance to be an important writer she had always dreamed of being. She still wrote about her private thoughts, her day-to-day life. But even before the end of the war, Anne was already thinking about the future, about her contribution to the chronicles of everyday life under German occupation. Anne was on fire with her new purpose, editing and rewriting every day. Her fellow refugees in the secret Annex didn't have similar projects to keep them going. For them, only one thing broke the daily monotony: the occasional visits from the non-Jewish helpers who were hiding them, at great personal risk. Otto's colleague Miep Gaze and her husband Jan visited as much as they could, providing both material supplies and news from the outside world. But terror stalked the Annex as the news from the outside world grew increasingly dire. Everyone in the Annex was well aware of the stakes. If they were found, they were unlikely to survive. And so despite the frustrations, despite the difficulties, Anne and her family did everything they could to stay quiet, stay hidden, stay together, stay strong. For 760 days, their luck held. On day 761, that luck ran out. It was August of 1944, just over 2 years since the Franks had gone into hiding. To this day, no one is entirely certain of who tipped off the SS, but someone had betrayed the family's hiding in the secret Annex. At first, it seemed like a standard house search. Well, if you ignored the revolver pointing towards the employees, as the soldiers ripped apart every box, every crate, every sack. When they came to the landing that led to the secret Annex, they paused. A casual observer would have seen nothing more than a bookcase and then moved on. These soldiers were not casual observers. They fiddled with the bookcase until it yielded. The secret door swung open. The soldiers forced their way in, and the 8 people in the secret Annex looked up and confronted their worst nightmare. It was a sunny summer morning. The kids were doing schoolwork, or trying to anyway, after 2 years without school. Quickly, the soldiers rounded them up at gunpoint, and they stood with their hands in the air. The soldiers searched the secret Annex, even shaking out Otto's briefcase where Kitty was hidden. Papers flew everywhere, all of Anne's secret hopes and thoughts now crushed under a soldier's boot. The soldiers hauled all 8 people away. 7 would never return, because their final destination was Auschwitz. Along with 1,000 other people, Anne and her family were herded onto a train so tightly packed it was hard to breathe. For 3 days, the train sped towards the camp in the east. When they finally arrived at Auschwitz, a third of the prisoners were in such terrible condition that they were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Anne and her family, however, were not among these unlucky travelers. All 4 of the Franks were enslaved in Auschwitz labor camps. It was hell. But at least the three Frank women were together. For a while, anyway. In November of 1944, Anne and Margot were deported from Auschwitz to another concentration camp. The Allied powers were gaining ground, and the Germans had no intention of letting their valuable workforce be liberated. So they sent thousands of prisoners to Bergen-Belsen, away from the Soviets and the Americans, who were getting closer by the day. Bergen-Belsen had never been a pleasant place, but as more and more prisoners poured in, rations shrank, and sometimes the inmates went days without food. Unlike Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp, but its prisoners still perished in the tens of thousands, felled by starvation and disease. Anne and Margot Frank were among them, succumbing to typhus within days of each other, just a few weeks before the British soldiers arrived to liberate the camp. Anne was 15 years old. After the liberation, Otto Frank returned to the Netherlands, the sole survivor of the secret Annex. Somehow, he had clung to life at Auschwitz. He was still alive when the Soviets finally arrived to liberate the camp. With no idea of his family's fate, Otto made his way back to Amsterdam, hoping against hope that his wife and daughters were still alive. But they weren't. All Otto had left of his family was Kitty, the journal into which Anne had poured her heart and soul. After the Germans had discovered the secret Annex and hauled away its residents, Miep Gaze had entered and found Kitty's pages scattered all over the floor. She gathered them up and waited, certain that one day, someone would come back. At first, Otto couldn't bear to read his daughter's words, but once he began, he couldn't put Kitty down. Was this his daughter? This bright, interesting, observant young writer, deeply thoughtful and occasionally biting? She was amazing. How many brilliant thoughts had lived inside her head? Anne was gone forever, but Otto refused to let her memory fade. His friends read the diary, astounded. One wrote that after finishing it, he felt transported, plucked away from his everyday life, back into the surreal world of German occupation. Otto's friends found him a publisher, and he edited the diary, condensing its story and cleaning up the parts he didn't want the world to read. Anne's secret thoughts, teenage musings on sex and romance, private family matters, including Anne's harsh observations about her parents' marriage. All of that would stay buried, Otto decided. It wasn't the world's business. He wanted the diary to focus on Anne's idealism and hopeful spirit. He wanted to force people to look at his daughter, at her hope and her goodness and her idealism, at her love for the world, despite her awful circumstances, and be inspired. His daughter had a message for the world, and maybe, just maybe, this teenager could help the rest of the world find some kind of healing as the entire globe confronted the scale of what had just happened. Anne likely would have had many thoughts about the version of her diary that eventually got published. Like all writers, she was prickly and precise about her work, and she probably would have made different choices than Otto, but she was no longer alive to be prickly and precise and a perfectionist. So Otto revised his daughter's thoughts as best as he could and sent it to publishers. The very first edition, in the original Dutch, was released in 1947. If she would have lived, Anne would have been 18 years old, and she might have been stunned by the diary's success. The Dutch version sold tens of thousands of copies. So did the French translation, and the German edition. But the English language publishers weren't so sure about this weird little post-war diary. Why would anyone want to read it? Why would anyone want a reminder of those terrible years? So the publisher ordered a modest print of 5,000 copies and allocated no money to marketing the book. But just as it did in Europe, the book flew off the shelves. A New York Times review praised the diary and its teenage writer, noting, "There is anguish in the thought of how much creative power, how much sheer beauty of living was cut off through genocide. But through her diary, Anne goes on living, from Holland to France to Italy, Spain. The Germans too have published her book, and now she comes to America. Surely she will be widely loved, for this wise and wonderful young girl brings back a poignant delight in the infinite human spirit." The reviewer was right. Anne was almost universally beloved. Her story is taught to children around the world, children who are the same age that she was when she was forced into hiding. And in her wisdom, her optimism, her precocity, and her goodness, Anne is now an icon, a stand-in for 6 million Jews slaughtered in 6 years. Her story is tragic but hopeful, lingering on the kindness of strangers, the inherent goodness of humanity. Because she didn't write about extermination camps. She didn't write about starvation or disease or mass murder. She didn't write about seeing her family lined up and shot, then piled in a mass grave. She didn't write about the journey to Auschwitz or the gas chambers or the chimneys that never stopped smoking. She wrote about hope, about life, about humankind's inherent goodness. And the most famous line from her diary is also the most ironic. "I still believe that in spite of everything, people are really good at heart." Anne's story provided a convenient introduction to the Holocaust. She was relatable, with a surprisingly modern voice, writing, "I know what I want. I have a goal. I have opinions. I know that I am a woman with inner strength and a great deal of courage." She was sassy. She was funny. She was thoughtful and inquisitive. And her story, though terrible, had a pleasing arc. But Anne's story, of course, is incomplete. It stops before discovery. It stops before Auschwitz, before Bergen-Belsen, before the end. And that makes it relatively easy to read. Holocaust historian Alvin Rosenfeld believes that the diary's popularity is an example of the Americanization of the Holocaust. He writes that the Anne Frank we remember is the one we want to remember. Reading her story makes us feel good, even optimistic, inspired. After all, if Anne could remain hopeful, so can we. She turned atrocities into affirmation. It's a comforting understanding of the Holocaust, and it's also incomplete. In a 1997 New Yorker article, the Jewish writer Cynthia Ozick reflected, "In the 50 years since The Diary of a Young Girl was first published, it has been boulderized, distorted, transmuted, traduced, reduced. It has been infantilized, Americanized, homogenized, sentimentalized, falsified, kitschified, and in fact, blatantly and arrogantly denied, all the while contributing to the subversion of history." That subversion began as early as 1952 with the first American edition of the diary. The publisher had asked former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to introduce the book. Her foreword included the claim that the diary is not preeminently a Jewish book. It will appeal equally to less specialized and larger groups of readers. Instead, is an example of the ultimate shining nobility of the human spirit, inspiring, palatable, and divorced from the wider context and mechanics of genocide. In the years since, Anne's legend has only grown. The secret Annex is Amsterdam's most popular tourist attraction, something to do between eating a fabulous pancake brunch and going to see the tulips. Even pop star Justin Bieber visited, writing in the guest book, "Anne was a great girl. Hopefully, she would have been a believer." It's easy to roll our eyes at Bieber, whose comment was clueless and uninformed. But Bieber is hardly the only person to misunderstand Anne's story. Anne has been appropriated and misused as a symbol by all sorts of groups who have zero understanding of or respect for her story. Pro-Hamas activists who depict her wrapped in a keffiyeh. Protesters who compare the COVID-19 lockdowns to the Frank family's retreat from the world. Even disgraced musician Roger Waters, who projected her name on screen during a concert in Germany, meant to draw parallels between Israel and Hitler's regime. At best, these are ignorant and offensive misuses of Anne's story. At worst, they're flatly anti-Semitic. But these are simply the most egregious misuses of Anne's image. By making her the symbol of the Holocaust, we reduce her from a complicated, sophisticated, sometimes prickly teenager to an almost saintly figure. A one-dimensional portrait of a good person, whose goodness stands in stark contrast to the tragic circumstances of her short life. And we sanitize the horrors she and other victims suffered by cutting off the story before Auschwitz, before Bergen-Belsen. Anne wasn't a metaphor for the resilience of the human spirit. She was a child murdered by the Nazis solely because she was Jewish. Her memory has been softened, whitewashed, and flattened, providing us with a comforting story about the Holocaust and the triumph of the human spirit. But Anne Frank's story is not the be-all, end-all of Holocaust education. It is merely the beginning.